everything's working. There. Oh, let me hit this button. Hello, welcome to Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to spread a little bit of democracy. But before we do that, Buddy, why don't you tell the folks at home what it is we do on this podcast?
On this podcast, we like to talk about games, and the good news is there's a new game that everybody's fucking talking about, I guess.
Yeah.
And that's Helldivers.
2.
Diving through hell for democracy, okay?
Yeah. It's a third-person shooter. I believe the first one was a top-down shooter, which is maybe why it didn't make as much of a splash as a PvE shooter. And it's captured the hearts and minds of lots of people. It's got like this is part of why we were talking about Starship Troopers, I think, last week. Like I cannot confirm this, but I am like 90% sure that the reason that Starship Troopers made its way back into discourse is that Helldivers is like an even more over the top version of Starship Troopers in terms of kind of like the propaganda-ish type stuff. So yeah, but the game is fun. Buddy, are you enjoying this game?
Yeah, okay. I actually have never looked at Helldivers 1, but it is a top-down shooter, which is interesting. It's really interesting that they kind of went from one to the other. Yeah, I have been having a very good time with Helldivers, and Helldivers feels very vindicating in a couple of different ways. It feels like a good sort of example of a number of like different, I guess I'd call them principles that I've had about sort of like gaming in, however long in recent times, I guess you would call it. And so I'm sort of unsurprised by its success, but it's also very cool that it has become so, it's become so successful.
Yeah. So you are the big PvE shooter guy out of the two of us. I dip my toes in occasionally. You get me into like Dark Tide. You got me to Dark Tide and occasionally Payday. So how does this measure up for you as compared to like those games, right?
I think it measures up pretty well. It's okay. Maybe I would say, the very best of these have a couple of different like qualities that I think Helldivers 2 definitely has. The most cogent one being objectives, right? I think when horde shooters are just about killing guys, right? Like surviving the wave, that's kind of when they're at their least fun and interesting. And there are some games that are good and can get kind of to the other side of that sort of like hurdle. Like I played a ton of the Mass Effect 3 multiplayer, right? Which was essentially just this. It was just waves on waves of guys. There were objectives, like every couple of rounds you had a very simple objective, but it was like stack on a point, right? Or, kill a certain bad guy, that kind of thing. This is very different than that, I would say. Because the real core of it is to successfully complete the objectives and then extract, right? And then get the hell out of there. And so that's something that I think is pretty core to the experience, right? In the same way that like, identifying the little plasma things in Dark Tide is pretty core to the experience, right? Or I don't know, what are some other examples of like Dark Tide objectives that we would do? I can't even think of them.
Yeah, I don't know. For me, Dark Tide started to feel samey after a little while. Have you ever played like COD Zombies?
Yeah, COD Zombies would be a really good example of this kind of in action, I would say.
Yeah, because COD Zombies is mostly about waves and it's about surviving as long as you can, but there are like many objectives that are also often kind of shrouded in mystery. Like that's kind of the appeal, is like there's layers to peel back. But yeah, what games have you had me play? You've had me play Payday 2, and what was the one with like the several different classes that was like Killing Floor, maybe?
Oh, Killing Floor. Yeah, actually, Killing Floor. Yeah, Killing Floor would actually be a good example of this. I loved Killing Floor for a while. We got really into Killing Floor. But that one was basically just sort of horde, like surviving like hordes and waves. I think that certain games can get to the other side of that in a way. And one of the ways they do that is through enemy variety. This is actually true for Mass Effect, I think. The thing that made the Mass Effect 3 multiplayer was interesting was sort of a combination of variety factors, right? You had enemy variety, which was there are a lot of different types of enemies requiring you to fight them in a lot of different kinds of ways, and knowing how to do that was pretty fun and engaging. And I think that's kind of how Killing Floor works. Killing Floor, you have sort of a certain, I don't even know what I would call it. It's almost like a meta game, I guess. You have like a certain sort of setup that can deal with different kinds of threats, right? So being able to deal with, I don't know, the what I can't remember the names of these like zombie types, but like they're the big chargy guys that have the metal hands, that kind of stuff, versus normal guys like just regular zombies who you pop their head like a zit kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess the other big, like, this game has some like relatively creative objectives, right? Like, breaking down things in like, actually, so some for people at home that don't know, a couple of the core mechanics, or one of the core mechanics is these things called stratagems, which is essentially you can call in support from your orbital ship, but it involves pressing a button and then inputting a cheat style type code that's on the screen. And the amount of stress that's like difficulty there is actually doing that while you're in the heat of the battle is super interesting. They use that mechanic also for the map objectives, right? Like in order to extract, you have to put in one of these codes. In order to like, do some of the side objectives, you have to put in these codes. And I think that's actually a really neat thing. Essentially, you've taken somebody out of the action. There's a couple of games that have done this. Like Darktide does this, right?
Yeah, with the little thing, you got to go back and forth.
Yeah.
You have one person who's just like trying to hit the thing, and all around them is like the you can hear like the sounds of carnage and stuff like that. I do think that that's like a really effective kind of pair of mechanics on top of each other.
Yeah, and something I will say is that like I appreciate the way that Helldivers does it, because it's the thing about Darktide is that like the thing's scanning back and forth, and based on pure luck, you could be like, oh, the next line is further away, right? Here, you don't have that limitation, right? You can always immediately advance to the next thing, but you might just screw it up because you're bad, right? So that feels like it's a lot more on you and a lot less kind of like based on random luck, which I think is
yeah. I also like
design.
the memorization piece of the puzzle. I've talked about the process of sublimation
Right.
for like World of Warcraft before, right? Where you are making it subconscious to do your rotation so you can focus on like other kind of stuff. The speed with which I sublimated some of those commands, where now I feel like if I want orbital strike to happen, I can just do it, and I don't even think about it. Do you know what I mean? Because just like I've done it a couple of times, and that's all I really needed to be able to whip the stratagem into a crowd of guys, and get them all blown up from air, basically.
Do you know? Can you say it off the top of your head? Because I think I can.
It's right down, right?
I thought it was upright right.
I don't. I always thought
Maybe I've been playing
I'm
with the Eagle Strike too much, because I swapped out Eagle Strike for orbital strike input Helldivers too. I wonder if it's different per person, right? Like if it's
that would be interesting.
No, it is not. Orbital precision strike is right up. So
okay, yeah. So right up is different than what I said right.
Yeah,
down.
I had it backwards. I said upright right, I believe.
Yeah.
So yeah, but that's the thing, right? Like if it sublimates, right, you don't have to know it like in your head. You can just kind of do it and like go back and think to it. This is actually reminds me a lot of like fighting game stuff, right? Like um, the DP input, especially on a hitbox style input, a leverless input style input, is kind of like I couldn't describe it, and like occasionally you have to go back and look at it to make it a little bit more consistent on my end. But like it's kind of like a muscle memory thing, right? It's kind of like it's some combination of forward and down in a way that's slightly different than down forward, which is your quarter circle forward for a Hadoken, and I can do it pretty consistently, but it's like not a thing that I consciously think about.
Yeah, so the stratagems I think are definitely a piece of kind of the overall picture, right? Especially because the different ways, I think cooldowns are a pretty important game mechanic at this point for most titles. It seems like the idea of a cooldown, a big powerful ability that you can use once every 20 seconds, every minute, every 6 minutes, whatever the sort of thing is pretty like fundamental game design that's in a bunch of different places, right? And one of the things that I kind of think is universally true is that if you have a cooldown, you want to put it on cooldown, right?
Right.
This is something that WoW teaches you, right? Don't hold your cooldowns, spend them. Spend them as quickly as possible, basically. Because the odds are that you are going to get, one of the things that people, I talk to a lot of people who like want to get good at Mythic Plus, and one of the things that I tell them is use your cooldowns, right?
Yeah.
People have this feeling of like, it's almost like hoarding potions in Skyrim, where it's like, oh, I'm gonna wait for this special Goldilocks. I'm not gonna use it on these 3 guys. It's like, just use it on the 3 guys. It'll be off cooldown faster, and you're gonna get in more over the course of the dungeon, right? Like if I'm using Bladestorm every time it's up in a dungeon, I am using more Bladestorms than if I set up Bladestorm for a perfect Bladestorm, and wait 20 or 30 seconds, right?
Plus, I feel like that's like the right model, right? Like maybe at like your very high level keys, right? Like, don't worry, I'll use my cooldowns right before lust every time. I am definitely feel that, but like
I've made that mistake so many times.
Yeah, but I think you've kind of got like that's like the right starting point, right? Is like use all your cooldowns immediately, maybe at higher level keys or in particular raid fights, right? It's like I will hold, right? Like, or delay by like 20 seconds or so. But you figure that out. You start from the position of use them all at once, use them all immediately, and then you change that as you need to.
Yeah, have you ever seen the Venn diagram that's like the brain dead person, the normie, not Venn diagram, I'm talking
it's the bell curve.
Yeah. And then on the far end is like the smart. That's sort of what it's like.
Yeah.
The brain dead person's like hold your cooldowns. The middle person is like use your cooldowns on cooldown, and then the far person is hold your cooldowns, because that is actually true. Something that I do in high level Mythic Plus is I hold my cooldowns, but for very specific moments, right? So damage phases when you need to beat a damage check, right? I'll hold my cooldowns for that, because like that, when you're pushing high keys, if you don't use your cooldowns that way, you'll wipe, kind of thing.
It's funny. I thought you were gonna go opposite with that. It's like dumb person's like unga bunga, use cooldowns. Middle person's like, no, I need to hold it for the correct moment. Wise person is like, just use your fucking cooldowns, right? Like, but
unga bunga.
Yeah, no, I mean,
and I think in Helldivers, it's probably like a similar thing, right? Like,
yeah,
I feel like I'm constantly trying to put stuff on cooldown and get really effective use out of it as often as I possibly can.
Yeah, and I think to your point, like this is an important part of design. I think maybe MOBA started to popularize this. I think the thing you talk about, like hoarding potions and scrim, I think this is like a long had problem, right? Where it's like if it's an actual consumable resource, you are going to you're gonna be more when I say consumable, when it's like a limited resource, you're gonna be more incentivized to hold on to it because you need it for the perfect moment, right? And if you use it too early, then you'll never get it back. But when it's on a cooldown, you theoretically have unlimited uses of it. It's just gated by time. And so I think even in the limited resource version of things, the answer is, use your limited resources more frequently. But it's like a thing that's like harder to do psychologically. So from like kind of like a game teaching you how to do it point of view, I think the cooldowns help with that. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I feel that 100%. I mean, I've been playing a lot of Grime recently, and there's a bunch of consumables in that game. And I have this feel, like it's not even like it's not even like I'm intentionally doing it. I just have this feeling of like, do I need to use consumables to beat this boss? If the answer is no, then I'm gonna hold them, right? Because it would otherwise kind of like be a waste or whatever. And I think that that's just like that's a bad framework that comes out of kind of obsessing about consumables. At least consumables in a way that they're not like, effectively infinitely replenishable, right? In WoW rating, I also use consumables, but because I can go on the auction house and buy 100,000 pots if I wanted to, it's never gonna matter.
Lou in the chat says, "What day is it? When am I?" I am occupied tomorrow night, and so we decided to do this early. Um, but yeah, no, I agree with you there. I think specifically in terms of like like the grind, which I will say is a Souls like. When you do a Souls likeification episode at some point, there's like a different calculus there because like if you're doing a bunch of attempts on a single boss and you're using a consumable every time and you run out of that consumable and you've been developing your strategy around that consumable, you can't do that anymore. This is like Souls have a slightly different thing because it's built around like running the same thing over and over again. Also, there's kind of like a idealized way to play the game is to parry every strike and not use any consumable ever, right? Like, beat it at level 0 or whatever, right? Like,
yeah. Part of that is about like risk aversion in a way. Like, how much risk are you willing to accept? And part of that gets mitigated by your choice to use permanent consumables, right?
Yeah. But yeah. But to bring it back to Helldivers, I do agree that like the stratagem kind of system, which is like you get a handful of mission ones, which is like there's universally a resupply, there's universally a reinforced, there's universally an SOS speaking if you have less than 4 people, which lets you like tell people like, hey, please join me. And then you get 4 to choose of your own. And there's a lot of variety there, and you can build up for each mission. I like that a lot. I actually think that's like super interesting thing to do, especially like I think it's a little bit slow in the beginning, right? Like I still only have like a couple of minor choices to make at this point. But I guess that's part of the model, right? Is you have to like space these things out in order for it to make sense.
Yeah, it's funny. The more I play these games, the more I find myself frustrated by these like early missions. I talked about this a little bit with Darktide, where part of the frustration with Darktide is that Darktide sucks until Darktide is really fun, right? Which is like the first, like maybe I would call it like the first like 15 levels of Darktide on any class. You feel like a wet noodle. Your stuff isn't coming together. You don't have the gear. Like your weapons are so low quality that like the gunplay is sort of purposefully bad. And I do kind of hate that about these kinds of games. Helldivers has this issue, but this issue is centered sort of around I guess I would call it like, I don't know, like genericness, right? To frame this another way, this is probably where I think Helldivers is maybe kind of at its worst in a way. One of the things that's really fun and fascinating about a game like Darktide is being able to play the game from wildly different perspectives, right? When I am playing a zealot preacher using a thunderhammer, right, I am playing a pretty fundamentally different experience than playing a veteran with a las rifle, right? One of these is encouraging me to stay back, is encouraging me to snipe, is encouraging me to kind of like take it slow. The other one is encouraging me to push forward, right? Be in the front lines, always be attacking, always be hitting things, that kind of stuff. The issue I sort of have with the early game of Helldivers is it forces you to just kind of this generic, almost like I would call like Soldier 76 build,
Yeah.
right? And it, even picking up the anti-materiel rifle, which theoretically turns me into something of a sniper, which I guess I've kind of been enjoying because I'm bringing it all my missions, right? It still hasn't sort of like given me the feeling that I really want, which is to kind of specialize by class in order to have sort of roles and balancing. Because one of the things that I think works particularly well in these sorts of PvE shooters is to have different people with different roles filling out a sort of party in like a D&D sense, right? You
Yeah.
almost have, your melee, your tank, your healer, right? Like that kind of stuff. And I think a lot of the other PvE, shooters kind of excel at this in ways that Helldivers hasn't maybe yet. But we also haven't gotten there, so I can't really like
Yeah.
know or say that definitively.
I will say that this is a thing that I've been thinking about because like the weapon advancement is battle pass style is the way I will put it, right? Like,
Yeah.
you unlock individual weapons with unlocks on the pass, and like this is something that I missed from Darktide, right? Is you get weapon drops, right? And like they can be different that way. And you can kind of like immediately get a little bit of build variation, which you don't get here, right? There are no drops in Helldivers. Everything's kind of deterministic from like a loot perspective, right? Like the different resources you get to bring up this stuff, right? Is like on the second or third page of the normal kind of advancement pass, there is a marksman rifle, right? And on the first page, there's a shotgun. And I assume that those help things feel differently. Like I picked up the shotgun a couple times when like, somebody else we were playing with was using it and dropped it when they died. And I was like, oh, I'll give it a shot just to see what it's like. And those do feel different, but it's not like it feels like you're intentionally specializing, especially because like everybody's kind of gated at the same point, if that makes sense, right? Like, everybody has access. Everybody pretty quickly will get access to the shotgun, but it's not like you can choose the shotgun or the marksman rifle. It's all kind of gated behind the same thing, at least initially.
Yeah, I also think that part of that it's a trade-off, right? There's kind of like an upside and a downside. The upside to this is that we walked into pretty high difficulty matches without an insane amount of trouble. We completed that hard mission, right?
Yeah.
Because that was like the crazy mission we did, right? Well, maybe we can talk about that one in a minute. But really, the thing that like in a game like Darktide or a game like Payday, the point of those games is to walk up a difficulty chain, right? Or same thing with Diablo 4, same thing with like Warcraft, like Mythic Plus keys, right? Whatever. The point is you do the content. Content gives you power. Power makes you do higher level content. That's the loop, essentially. Helldivers, because the first gun you start with is sort of balanced in a way to be a good gun.
Yeah.
Right. You can kind of walk up the difficulty ladder immediately, and we sort of did that. I actually sort of felt like I guess it's trivial, easy, medium, challenging, hard. Is that
Yes, I believe. Yeah.
Like when we did that challenging mission, that felt fine, right? The hard mission felt very, very hard, right? And I would probably say that we got some level of carried by, two randos who were higher level or whatever, and there was all this other kind of stuff. But I can definitely see a situation where even at level 5 or 6, which is kind of where like you and I are at, we're just farming things at challenging, just because like that's like the difficulty that we feel pretty confident that we can work with, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm definitely.
I would say let's examine that for a second because I think that's like an interesting thing to bring up, right? Like there's not so you can split things into kind of like what I will call hard power and kind of like which is like straight improvements and like I'm gonna call it check gating and side grades, right? Like a lot of stuff is side grades, right? Like the assault rifle versus the shotgun is like a pure side grade, right? There is what I'm going to call check gating is this thing where like, until somebody can reliably bring an armor piercing thing, there are some missions that will be hard, if not impossible, because the only way to kill an armored thing is to, like either dodge around, like most things have a weak spot that you can dodge around, or like an orbital strike, or like land a reinforcement pod on the thing, which is like not reliable at all. So like those things I think are like what I call a check gate. Like as soon as you get access to that, it's pretty good. You can get that pretty early. There is a little bit of hard power, right? Like I haven't unlocked any of them yet, but like the things that require samples, right? Those are straight improvements, right? Like, the thing that like reduces a cooldown or reduces, increases the power of they're all like stratagem based.
Yeah.
And I think that like those, and they're all eventually unlockable, so that's like a straight power curve, I guess. But like, um, those are I suspect the difference between like a challenging and a hard, rather than. But like you said, most of the things are like relatively completable by new people, which is interesting. But yeah, I don't know exactly how I feel about that. You have
Yeah, I
differences?
also have complicated feelings because I think challenge is sort of like relative. Actually, I have found Helldivers pretty fun, but I think it's probably pretty easy if I'm being honest, which is kind of wild. But like when I compared the challenge of Helldivers to the challenge of high level Payday 2 or high level Dark Tide missions, right? Even high level like Mass Effect 3 kind of like multiplayer missions. I I think it's easier. I think that it's kind of fundamentally an easier game, and I think part of that is just due to sort of some of the other aspects of like the game's nature, right? The ability to kind of like kite stuff around, and some of the ways that you can kind of avoid conflict if you choose to avoid conflict, that kind of thing. Um, but I also think maybe that's quietly better. One of the things that's funny is, I've talked about Ghostcrawler before. Ghostcrawler was the game director of World of Warcraft for a long time. He had a thread on Twitter years after he left the World of Warcraft team where he wanted to talk about heroic dungeons. Okay. Basically, World of Warcraft Classic had created a new game mode called Heroic Plus Dungeons for Wrath of the Lich King Heroic Dungeons. And he was kind of talking about how it was really interesting to sort of like make that choice and make that decision. And he wrote a whole thread about how um, it's counterintuitive because players say they want challenging content. When players do trivial content, it makes them churn from the game a lot of the time. I'm churned. I'm sorry. They like drop the game. They like they stop playing, kind of thing, right? Um, but when we gave players a real challenge, they just stopped doing the content. And what he's referring to is in Wrath of the Lich King, heroic dungeons were famously easy. I used to run them, with friend Lou in the chat, right? Like I used to run them. We would pull all of the trash onto the boss and then AoE it down, and we would just do that 4 times basically. And that was how we like ran these fucking dungeons, right? Um, and in Cataclysm, they were famously hard. They were really, really like the heroic dungeons that were released at the Cataclysm launch were incredibly challenging, incredibly difficulty. And what he describes is players said they wanted that challenge of the Cataclysm dungeons, and then they stopped doing the content. And he said, and no matter what we tried, we couldn't get players to do heroic dungeons basically after that point. We're seeing a very similar thing now in WoW terms. Basically, season 3 of World of Warcraft in Mythic Plus is quote unquote an easy patch. This is something you'll see all the time over like Mythic Plus places, right? This is basically the easiest patch of Mythic Plus basically ever, and I can attest to that, right? We got to 2500s, we got to our portals much faster this season than we did last season. Last season we struggled in some of these 20s. Now 20s are like I'm doing it in my sleep practically, right? And somebody pulls the numbers every week to show the number of Mythic Plus runs that happen every week. Normally it's about 1 million, right? It's about 1 million Mythic Plus runs that happen every single week in WoW. At the 14-week point of this season, which is maybe like halfway through kind of the season we expect, we have run more total Mythic Plus dungeons than the entirety of season 2, which was famously a hard season for Mythic Plus, right? Which seems to suggest people want Mythic Plus to be easy, right? They want Mythic Plus to be a reliable thing that they can get on and they can complete these keys and they can farm them and all this other sort of stuff. And I think Helldivers has is probably more proof of this in action, right? It's a pretty forgiving game. It's a game where, you can be a level 5 kind of idiot walking into an like a hard automatons fight or whatever with out of coordination with 2 other members of your squad. You deplete all of your reinforcements, but you still complete the mission because you're able to avoid combat, you're able to drop combat. You're able to approach things kind of in like a clever way. And maybe that's why it's so fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't I don't know if I completely agree with that. Like that mission that we went through was kind of brutal, right? Like, it was not the most fun thing in the world, right? Like especially like once we depleted all the resources and we had to kind of like struggle to like finish it out. Um uh but I definitely think your point is relatively well taken. I also think we haven't seen like the upper echelons of the difficulty, right? Like, we have just cracked kind of like the middle tier. There's like a whole third type of sample that we haven't even seen yet, right?
Yeah, I guess that's true.
So my guess is that but I think the thing you're pointing to is that like it is like we've talked about this, but like I talked about this last week with like Diablo, right? Or Diablo which Diablo are we on now? 4?
Yeah.
Diablo 3, like those rifts, right? Like the way to play it was typically farm it, like play rifts at the level that you could reliably clear it easily, not push rift levels, right? And I think that's can you guys hear that? Can you hear Collins?
Yeah, what's up?
I think he wants me to leave so he can poop, but I'll deal with it. I will deal with that later. Sorry, my point was gonna be is like having a ladder to climb that has at all levels a point that's relatively easy, that makes it worth it, right? Like my guess for Mythic Plus is, and this I've thought about maybe jumping into Mythic Plus at some point, is like by making the higher echelons easier, you can get the loot, right? Like I am right now capped by heroic loot because all I do is raid, right? And like I guess I could grind those out enough that I could get enough crests that I could trade them up. But I'm probably not going to do that anytime soon.
But like theoretically, this is true. Actually, one of the things that we talk about all the time in Mythic Plus is like the value of 11s and the value of 18s, right? 11s are the first tier that you can get worm crests, right, to upgrade here. So one of the things that you do is when you get kind of worm gated, you just farm 11s for like a year. You just sit there and you just churn a million of them. They each take 10 minutes and you do them enough until you get all the worm crests you need to upgrade all your gear. And then when you need to farm aspect crests, you farm 18s because 18s are the first tier that you get aspect crests after every dungeon. But also the first tier that you get mythic track gear in the vault, right? So this is the highest kind of like tier of gear that you can get in sort of the vault. And I think that does motivate a lot of how we approach kind of like Mythic Plus, right? Obviously, I've done a lot of pushing this season. I'm like Baron is the #1 warrior on the server, like top 100 US kind of thing. But like the sort of reality is that at a certain point, I just had a whole conversation with people about this last night. It's like I don't want to push anymore. There's no reason for me. There's nothing to gain by pushing more. I have all the portals. I have Keystone Hero. I have Keystone Master. I have the mount. Right? Like all that stuff is already done at this point. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean the point for pushing at that point would be because you can, and it's a thing you find fun, right? Like it's like speed running a game, right? Like there is no reason to try and beat Super Mario Brothers in under 2 minutes or whatever the timer's at now, right? Like you do it because it's it's a personal thing that you enjoy, right? Same thing with Mythic Plus. You want to push higher keys because you think you can, not because there's an extrinsic reward to it.
And one of the things I think is interesting about difficulty is also like something I've said, like I walked into an 18 on my Holy Paladin. I never played Holy Paladin before. But we just needed a healer and I wanted to play my Paladin. So I was like, fuck it. I'll, rip a talent off like a thing of talents and I'll heal this 18. And we did that and we timed it actually, funnily enough. It was just like if you are a player, like, okay, really what I'm describing is part of the difficulty is just about learning the dungeon, right?
Right.
And that happens agnostic of your class, right? Like you can just learn the dungeon on anybody. I know what the
agnostic of the
phases
difficulty
are.
too, right? Like at some level. Like
yeah, exactly. It's like because I know the dungeons well, I can walk into some, keys at like really low item levels. Like something I've said before is that like you can do up to like 15s or 16s just like with like a fresh character if you wanted. We once tried this in Shadowlands. We leveled a bunch of new characters together, and we just pushed them as far as we could go, and we got to like I think 13 in like basically quest screens, right? Just by knowing the dungeons, just by kind of like having kind of good fundamentals. And one of the interesting things about Helldivers is I don't think we have good fundamentals. We don't know the dungeons, we don't know the maps, we don't know like all of this, stuff. I had never fought a Hulk before. I had never known what the appropriate way to deal with a Hulk is, right? But we were still like able to get kind of like up there and start farming stuff, or not farming stuff, and start completing missions, because the power portion of that is much more truncated, right? It's something like Mythic Plus, you're gonna get 40 or 50% of your power just by going from eye level like 420. I think it's actually 60, right? Because each item level represents about 1% player power. So by going from eye level 420 to eye level 480, you are getting 60% of your player power. There's nothing even close to that in Helldivers. In Helldivers, right, maybe you have better options, or maybe you have, I don't know, like a 10% reduced cooldown or something like that, for some of your stratagems. But like at the end of the day, the anti-materiel rifle is still going to hit for the damage that it's going to hit for, and that's true at level 6 and that's true at level 20, right?
Right. Yeah. No. And it's just a matter of like, I think the lower stuff are more generalized tools, and like, the power you're going to get is if you plan for missions. Like, oh, there will be this thing, and I will take this specialized tool that will let me deal with this specialized enemy better, and I don't have to worry about this other type of specialized enemy because I'm not like, I'm fighting automatons instead of like, they're not Tyranids, they're called like Terranids, it's basically what Terminids, right? Is that what yeah, basically
like
Tyranids with the the numbers filed, the serial number filed off.
Yeah, that's it. Do you know what the third faction is?
I do not. I
Okay.
know that there was something in Helldiver, like in Helldivers 1 there was a third faction, but I just am unaware of it.
Okay. I think the other thing that makes Helldivers special, this is I've that I'm sort of shitting on Helldivers a little bit by talking about some of this like difficulty stuff, but something else I want to say.
So real quick, Arahi in the
Sure.
chat says Zerg. I have heard that the third faction is effectively Protoss. So there's that.
Oh, that's actually kind of pog. One other thing I want to talk about with Helldivers is the nature of the open world missions. I actually think if there's any true innovation to Helldivers that's making it successful, to me it's this. A lot of players get really on board and sort of interested in, I think, these sort of big open world games, right? It's something that it's kind of like a 2010 thing that like gamers were kind of like complaining about, was like open worldification of stuff where you just have like a bunch of like Ubisoft Towers, just like a bunch of little like shit to do on your map. The innovation that Helldivers seems to bring you is that some of the missions, not all the missions are like this. Some of the missions are just you go into a big open map and there's just like a bunch of little things you can do. Like you just run around with your bros and you align a radio tower that gives you $100 or like 50 experience or whatever that you like, whatever it is. And the idea is you kind of snake your whole way around and do all of these side objectives. You clear out bug nests, open like little vaults or whatever, until you get to kind of like the main aspect of sort of the missions. And this is where Helldivers is at its coolest, right? The most fun I had playing Helldivers, and unfortunately you weren't here for this one, was when you went to bed and Gavin took your spot and we did a big automatons mission. And it was the first time I had ever seen outposts. It was the first time we had ever done it was the first time we'd ever done outposts. It's the first time we'd ever done the radio tower thing. And we were just snaking around the map, and we were kind of like going kind of piece by piece. But it reminded me of the fun I have when I do an outpost in Far Cry 5, right? It's like doing that with friends, basically, is what Helldivers feels like. And I think that's really cool. That's really awesome. There's a lot to be said for the way in which it trusts you to have fun with longer, more in-depth missions than something that is. I think let me frame this another way. I think one of the reasons that Darktide felt samey after a certain point is because you memorize the missions. you sublimate the missions at a certain point, right? And we have maybe you can do that in Helldivers, and maybe in a week we'll be like, okay, actually, never mind, I've sublimated the shit out of these missions or whatever. But for now, the process of exploring the map, finding a bonus objectives, and getting stuff like samples or whatever, like that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think there's two things here. One, which is that the maps are kind of random, right? Like you can tell when you look at them, it's like a bunch of assets that are like, copy pasted at different points, right? They're different kind of like things, and that works, right? It works for the setting, right? It's like these are space planets with prefabricated installations, right? So it makes sense that they all look the same. But even then, the fact they're not in exactly the same place, I think, makes a difference. And on top of that, the thing you're talking about with Dark Tide is that the objectives are like they're the sweet spot of like generic, like they're generic, but like openly generic. This is not going to make sense, but like every time you do like the mission with the skull in like the servitor in Dark Tide, it's like literally the exact same thing, right? Like you're walking through the same environment, you're hitting the same buttons, and like maybe a console is moved from like two of the three places are swapped around or something, right? But they're like where those three spots are, and it's going to be two of those three spots. In this game, they're like on an eggs mission. The eggs are going to be somewhere, and those eggs are going to look relatively similar, like one of a handful of things. But like shooting the eggs is generic enough that like it's kind of like just like shooting enemies in a way that's like not too like the moment to moment gunplay is good enough that like just kind of generically shooting eggs is fine, and it also doesn't feel like because the activity is generic, it doesn't feel like you're doing the same thing, if that makes sense. Does this make sense to you at all?
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. It's kind of good procedural generation, in my opinion, right? I shit on procedural generation a lot. I think that in general, it's sort of like an overused thing. This is part of my problem with like Starfield when we were talking about Starfield, right? When you procedurally generate 1,000 planets, I like it just makes me not care, right? I want to do honestly something like Dark Tide is good in this way, in that it is like a carefully crafted experience that has sort of like art to it, right? Or like a Mythic Plus Dungeon is this kind of way, right? Versus something where like you just put a bunch of generic assets into a procedural generated sort of like slurry, right? The thing that makes it work here, in my opinion, is the nature of the open it's that open world sort of nature. In Dark Tide, all of the rewards really are kind of baked into the are kind of like baked into the back of the mission, right? It is beat the mission, that's where most of your rewards come from. In Helldivers, it's everything, right? Like the idea is that you full clear, you go to your mission site, you do every little individual piece of the puzzle, right? And I think that's part of what makes it kind of like special and what makes it sort of like work. It's kind of giving you a 45-second slice of this like Assassin's Creed tower gameplay that's fun, but also it gets out before it gets tedious, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you can also kind of like, because the rewards are generic enough, it's not like you feel like you have to do every single one of them if you're not feeling it, right? It's like, well, we can do like half of them or whatever. We can just do the ones that we run across. But the thing,
like when we fucked up so bad and we lost all of our reinforcements, just like getting churned by these like automatons or whatever, we just beelined the main objective and extracted, right?
Yeah.
And that's like a choice you get to make when you're out of control.
Yeah. And the point I wanted to make is actually kind of the opposite of what you were saying, which is like, I think the genericness of some of the objectives is a strength here, and maybe it's because you do like a couple of generic objectives, that in like in a string instead of doing like the same three like very detailed objectives, and also like being generic enough that it's hard to recognize them as being exactly the same, right? Like I said, when you're doing some of these missions in Dark Tide, they feel like exactly the same, or like the same enough that it like it doesn't feel like there's this corridor where like there's a horde of things attacking you, and you need to like wait for a thing to charge, and occasionally the thing says, "Oh no, it's been interrupted. Go like hit the console until it works again," right? And it's the same 3 consoles, and 2 of them are active in any individual run, and it looks exactly the same, right? These egg pods, like I've seen a couple that look the same, but there's just enough variety, and like the surrounding circumstances are different enough they don't feel the same, even though they are mostly the same. If that makes sense. I think part of that's
Yeah,
this open world thing, right? Like I think like the kill 131 automatons one, right? Like I think that one gets samey really quick because it is the exact same map, right? Like the escorts the scientists to the middle building. I think those will get tired pretty quickly, but there are also kind of like they are shorter missions that are like infill missions in between the big explory ones, right? And I think that's how that works.
yeah. I also think that I'm not convinced that I will like this going for. Okay. I made a comparison to Far Cry before, where I sort of said clearing an outpost in Far Cry sort of feels like clearing an outpost in this, and that's actually kind of not true, because clearing an outpost in this is sort of just like everybody like whips big bomb stratagems into the thing, and it blows up the outpost, and you get a big, you know what I mean? Like, the thing that makes outposts fun in Far Cry is you approach them as these, like, you can do them a couple of different ways. You can be the one-man Rambo army, where you run in and you're just running and gunning, and you have a bunch of different guys and they have cover and they're whipping grenades at you. You need to be kind of, like, tactical about your movement, but you can also approach them sort of like stealthily. You can have a plan, right? My favorite thing in these is, have I ever talked about this before in the podcast? I like C4 in Far Cry games. I think C4 is very fun. What you do is you plant a bunch of C4, and then you set it all off at once, and you kind of have this like Rube Goldberg machine that you have set up, right? When you put a bunch of C4 on a bunch of different pieces of the thing, you can just kind of like hit the button and like let the outpost clear itself, because you have C4 on the animal cage, which releases the animals, and it's going to go do this. You have C4 on the gas tank, which is going to blow up the thing. You have C4, you have proximity mines, where the cars that are going to the outposts are going to come in and they run over the proximity mines, and you kill all the reinforcements. It's like that's what's like fun about outposts in Far Cry 5. I haven't there's nothing close to that when it has come to doing these outposts in Helldivers, right? And maybe we'll get there. Maybe like that's like a difficulty thing, or it's like a coordination thing. Maybe when you're doing the very highest level of missions with a coordinated group of like 4 guys, right? You'll be in a situation where you've got your sniper doing Overwatch, right? You've got your big tanky shotgun
Yeah,
boys going in and getting all the, kind of like quote unquote aggro, right? You have people being grenades over the walls in order to clear out, I don't know, like whatever
yeah,
that,
maybe
right?
like we'll get to a point where like you can't afford to everybody whip your orbital strike at this tiny base, because you are going to need that to deal with the enemies at some point.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that I haven't, I'm not sure if Helldivers will get there, when Helldivers will get there. One of the things that's fun about like Dark Tide, or some of these other sorts of games, is it's like the party composition, and part of that is like being able to deal with different sort of enemies effectively, right? Like when you are a sniper veteran, built around killing elites and special enemies, and you kind of ignore the riffraff. The riffraff are for psychers, right? Who do big wave crowd control. They just do a lot of damage to a million different enemies all at once, that kind of thing. Or like veteran, not veteran, like zealot preacher or something. Like a zealot preacher carrying a chainsword is going to cut down all of the waves of enemies on his own. You don't need to worry about it. So you have different people who are sort of like specialized. And I wonder if Helldivers will kind of like get there for me or for us, depending on how you kind of like unlock guns and armor and all of that other sort of stuff. Who knows? Time will tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What other aspects of this game do we want to talk? Let's talk about the
lore.
theming. Yeah, the theming.
Yeah. Okay.
You go ahead, since I know you talked about this yesterday. You
yeah.
mentioned...
Okay. Something I've said in the podcast before. This is maybe one of the things I feel very vindicated. Some of the things I've said about on the podcast before is that players constantly sort of assert that flavor doesn't matter, but it does, right? This is something that was very true in the World of Warcraft Shadowlands days, with covenants. People were like, I should be able to swap covenants whenever I want, right? And the like tying player power to this theming is bad. And the logical sort of extension of this is this idea that like people play World of Warcraft because They like hitting buttons and making number go up. And theoretically, you could replicate that just by stripping all the flavor out, right? If you had a game and the game is just gray polygon people, and your polygon people interact with abilities, and the abilities aren't named, Mortal Strike and Overpower and Execute. They're named, ability 1, ability 2, ability 3. You could replicate the entirety of the systems of World of Warcraft and strip out every aspect of flavor, and the game would be less fun. The game would be worse, right? The flavor matters. It's part of the package, right? And I think Helldivers is proof of that. Helldivers has this perfect sort of mix of tone between kind of like that, like this like oorah, like Starship Troopers kind of like
Hyper
satire of,
patriotism.
of like jingoistic kind of like patriotism. And it shows up in the smallest ways that are kind of unobtrusive, right? It'll be like a tip, you know. Um what are some of the tips that we've like seen?
Friendly fire isn't.
Yeah, it's stuff like that. It's like you could always you could always extract from a mission early if you're a coward, right?
Yeah.
Like like stuff like that, right? Um and it just helps it helps the game, right? It connects players to sort of like the world in the lore in such a way that like being able to say, you said this thing yesterday when you were like, it's nice to be able to say democracy, right, when I want to get people to play the game with me, right? And I think I do think that that's real. I think that
Yeah.
that's like fun, right? In the same way that like I might, when we're talking about Payday, I would say, let's go rob banks, right? Or in Dark Tide, right? We would say Emperor, right?
Yeah.
I think all of that is sort of like a testament to kind of, being able to sort of immerse yourself in whatever way in sort of the alternate headspace that the game wants you to kind of like get into.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, and this game is good about it at like all levels, right? From, giving the Helldivers capes, right? Which is just, it's like a flourish, but it's like a thing that kind of like sells this kind of like vaguely you know, uh, like Uberbenchian kind of like, vision, right? Plus, like, like when you drop out of the hellpods, right? Like calling it hell, right? Even, right? Like, when you drop out of the hellpods, it plays this like bombastic orchestral music, like you're like you're in a war movie, right? Like going to like,
Yeah,
do your
funnily enough,
part.
it's not actually orchestral. It's brass.
Right.
I'm sorry. Just to explain this for a second. This is when you think of, man, how do I explain this? Okay, so I've talked about leitmotifs before, right? A leitmotif is a song that's a person that represents something, like a noun, like a person, place, or thing, right? So, for instance, the Imperial March represents the imposing authority of the Empire in Star Wars, right? There are different ways that you can create sound. This is called timbre, right? The texture of a sound being made by a different instrument changes the nature of the leitmotif. Um, One of the things that we associate with heroic leitmotifs, right, like the Superman theme or something like that, is big, upbeat brass ensembles. Brass being trombones, trumpets, that kind of stuff. And that's exactly what Helldivers does. It's essentially kind of like like the Avengers theme is
Yeah.
in the exact same. It has the exact same timbre, right? Whereas something like what would be another of like, I don't know. There are other sort of like leitmotifs that are using like different,
Yeah.
I guess,
Like
different
electronic
sounds.
music sounds futuristic, right? Like,
Yeah. Oh, actually, a good one would be the piccolo. It's not piccolo, maybe it's just an actual flute or a clarinet. The piccolo or the clarinet for the Shire theme in Lord of the Rings, right? That is like a very homey sound. It's a safe sound, like it is
yeah.
it represents the idea of home to these hobbits who are humble, right? They have no ambition and they're not tempted by like the great sort of like whatever, like the glory and triumph and honor that like that like soldiers are, right? Like that has a very different feel than the bombastic sort of brass ensemble that plays when you are dropping. And I feel like it's maybe the best game since, well, actually that's true. I think Dark Tide is also very good at music, but in a much different way. It's maybe the best game since Overwatch to do, in my opinion.
Yeah. I was say I've been playing a lot of Cyberpunk, and it has some of this, and a lot of that is kind of like, it's electronic-y feeling music, and I don't think it's as good as Helldivers, right? But like, kind of this is more about kind of like cutting in and cutting out with like the correct upbeat stuff. Although there was a moment where I was like, what the fuck is playing the other day? And it was like, some like J-pop thing that was playing over the in-game radio. I'm like, I hate this. And so I switched it to like Outrun style stuff. But
yeah,
like,
I mean, it's it's funny because like I think a lot of video game soundtracks for a long time is just like play a soundtrack in the background, loop it a bunch. That's kind of
yeah,
it. But we have gotten better about Overwatch is the thing that I think started this trend in 2016, where Overwatch adds or subtracts music from the background depending on what's going on. When you are close to a checkpoint, the music ramps up and creates this crescendo feeling of, oh my god, we have 10 seconds to push the payload 50 meters or we lose, kind of thing, right? And then that kind of carries forward. Dark Tide, I obviously mentioned. The thing I like about the music in Dark Side is that the music keys you into what's happening. So when a boss spawns, you hear the boss music first, right? And you go, "Oh my god, there's a Beast of Nurgle ahead," right? Or when a horde spawn, right? You'll hear that, like that kind of music. And I feel like we're at this point in kind of like we're kind of at like here. Helldivers is a bunch of this when you're about to extract and all that stuff.
I would say the finals has this in a way that's like kind of like, I don't think it's like perfect, but I don't even think it's super great. It's just kind of like when a team is about to win, it kind of like starts playing this like swelling music. It's like, oh, we need to fucking like book it over there and kill those people, right? Otherwise, they're gonna win the round. I don't think it quite works. It isn't quite working the way that I think they want it to. It kind of like, but like I think it's still a neat thing, right? If that makes sense, yeah. But yeah, no, I think that's very true. Like the theming in this game is I think what's getting people to stay around, right? Like you see people on Reddit making like fake propaganda posters, right? I am like I said, 90% sure this is what kicked off the Starship Troopers kind of like conversation again.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, I absolutely think it was. And I obviously like, I don't know. I have complicated feelings about sort of like all of this, right? Partially, it's that this is one of those situations where fascism is getting thrown around a lot, and I think most people aren't like. Even Starship Troopers itself kind of isn't fascist in a way.
It's got fascist trapping. Part of the problem is that like there's a bunch of problems with it, and I don't like it's that there is the movie does not in its text give you a reason to think that humanity is wrong, right? Like there might be like a thing in somewhere about like we started it or whatever, but like there are a bunch of these bugs that are killing people, right? Like they destroyed Buenos Aires, and like people who like make defenses of it have to be like, well, maybe actually it was a false flag attack, but like there's nothing in the text to actually support that. That's the thing that people are making up with kind of.
So that's well, it depends on the movie or the book. In the movie, technically speaking, it is actually the humans because it is Mormon settlers who settle outside of designated colonization zones that triggers the bugs to attack Buenos Aires, and then it like escalates from there. Is like what's in the movie. But I also think that people misunderstand the movie because the movie is quite an indictment of humanity in like a direct sense. The quote that Paul Verhoeven gives, people always say, "Oh, it's because Paul Verhoeven like says like the movie is like a satire of fascism." The thing that Paul Verhoeven says is that war makes fascism or makes fascists of all of us, and I wanted to make a movie where the fascists were at their best, or he said the satire of the movie is the fascists are at their best, and the best thing that they do is kill bugs. Right. And it is about the idea that like this is not a grand society that has achieved, I don't know, like any of the other sort of like what we might call markers of like transcendental living or life. The only purpose of this society is to kill bugs. Right. And that's the like the piece of it. But it's like I don't actually think people make that kind of argument when they about Paul Verhoeven and Starship Troopers and
no, and like you are correct. The Mormons are what like start the thing, but like there are people who like because even then, right? Like the Mormons kind of doing that is maybe bad, but probably not deserving of like, the nuking of a city. And so I have like people be like, well, maybe it was a false flag attack on Buenos Aires because, and like I think that that's mostly cope, right?
Yeah.
This is also a thing that like there's this historian on Twitter, or X formerly known as Twitter, Brett Devereaux, who's like, part of the issue with these movies that try and satire fascism is that it shows them being good at war. Historically, fascists aren't good at war, right? Like,
Yeah, it's like one of the big myths about Nazi Germany is that the trains always ran on time. When they didn't, they were famously late always. There were tons and tons and tons of logistical issues to, sort of the kind of like the Nazi war machine.
Right. Yeah. No. And there's like a bunch of stuff in there too. Like the other criticism I've seen is that Paul Verhoeven never read Starship Troopers, so he didn't finish it, right? And like Heinlein is like a lot less is a lot more of a fan of kind of like essentially giving yourself over to a sacrifice for a greater ideal, which like kind of cross pollinates with fascism a little bit, but isn't exactly that, right?
Oh, that was Italy. Yeah, I mean, and it's even funnier if it was Italy because Italy famously like the dead weight of the Axis, right? Who just kind of fell over at every possible opportunity in the face of British and American.
Yeah, Italian fascism is also like characteristically different than like German fascism. Like all of like the worst stuff, right? Like of German fascism is like arguably like not even like core fascist, right? Like it's core kind of like, there's an argument that some of that came from like the American eugenics movement, right? Like there are a bunch of people in Wisconsin who are big fans of Mr. Hitler up until like a certain point, right? Like,
oh yeah, I mean like what's it? Charles Lindbergh was like the leader of the American Fascist Party, right?
Yeah, I know. I mean, like the kind of like it's progressive politics, but not like modern progressive politics. Don't want to be like, and the progressives like, but like Buck v. Bell, famous Supreme Court case. 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Like made basically eugenics state level eugenics programs legal, right? Like this is a thing that that happened and like is part of like the thing that's in the air, like kind of like a version of scientific racism that kind of gets transposed to Nazi Germany, and like there's some like weird like Italian fascism has like the member of Jewish people who are members of the Italian Fascist Party, they are like overrepresented in the Italian Fascist Party among the general population because it didn't have that kind of like anti-Semitic aspect that German fascism did. And my understanding is that the Italians kind of resisted a lot of that German influence until basically, Hitler like sweeps in, makes Mussolini like a puppet, and like kind of like knocks over that entire thing. But that's history and not video games, I guess.
I mean, I think the overall point is like, the idea that this sort of stuff glorifies fascism is like, in a certain sense, I want to say that is the point, right? Because the idea is that like the Starship Troopers or Helldivers, or like even like you might say like Warhammer 40K, though I have obviously very different thoughts about Warhammer 40K. These show a world where fascism is competent and effective, right?
Yeah.
But the satire is not in saying, hey, this thing is good, this thing is bad. The satire is in saying the only thing this, like the best this society can do, kill bugs, right? Like that.
Yeah.
That's what that
war.
Core of it is, exactly. Is like the piece that matters, I guess. I don't know. I would say what else is that matters in kind of like the discussion. Like there are people who are saying the wild cope I have seen, I guess, on Twitter, formerly X, about sort of the idea that like I don't even know how to phrase this. The Terminids are, I guess I would call them the indigenous population. Like I read a thread about a guy who was basically saying, what if we found, sapient apes in the jungles of the Congo and we decided we wanted to colonize the Congo, and so we kill all the apes. I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? It's like that meme with Walter White and Jesse from Breaking Bad. It's like, Jesse, what the fuck are you talking about? It's like, they're maybe they are just animals, right? And you're just killing them. Maybe they are weirdly sapient and you're also just killing. It's like I don't. Who cares? They're like they're space bugs. I don't understand. We're not going to reason with the space bugs. We can't do diplomacy with the space bugs.
Right, yeah. No, and like, what's the answer, right? Like there's no indication that that, like you said, it's cope, right? It's people inventing a reason to be mad at this game because there are people that they don't like that are very happy about this game, right? Like that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that it's just like there's sort of like a greater, I don't know, there's like a certain 16-year-old on Reddit's first media literacy that comes across in this, right? Where it's like, for instance, 40K, this is why I brought up 40K. 40K is explicitly horrifying, right?
Yeah.
It is an awful place. You don't want to live in 40K. This is a core piece of sort of I would say 40K lore, right? It's almost a tragedy in a way that the Imperium is set up the way it is because the Emperor, he hated religion or whatever, but he himself has become deified, right? And the whole of the kind of I don't know, fascist theocracy or whatever. The only space book I want to do diplomacy with is Kerrigan. Listen, hey, I get that. Okay. With 40K, people will make the point that if you like 40K, you're supporting fascism, and it's no, we're thinking, comprehending individuals. This is a dark, terrible, grimdark, awful place. I don't want to be a citizen of the fucking Imperium, right? It's not promoting fascist ideals or whatever because I'm capable of understanding that this is a bad thing. I don't want to live here, kind of thing. Even if it is a fun place to set games where pop zits.
Yeah, and it's fun to play into the character even there, right? That doesn't mean you endorse kind of the underlying ideals, right? There's neat lore, but no one wants to live in a hive city, right?
Yeah, it's kind of it's the idea that Lord of the Rings turns people into monarchists, right? Because part of the underlying theming of Lord of the Rings is that when you restore the one true bloodline to the throne, right? The corruption of Denethor or Wormtongue is that they are ignoble leaders, right? Who don't deserve the throne in the same way the noble line of kings do. But it's I don't actually think Lord of the Rings doesn't actually turn people into fucking monarchists, right? Nobody's going, ooh, actually, I read Lord of the Rings, and I gotta say, I have some real thoughts about fucking monarchy. Let's bring that back, right?
Yeah, let's put Viggo Mortensen on the throne.
Yeah, exactly. Right? We are thinking, capable beings of agency who can project into other sorts of worlds and circumstances without necessarily bringing some of the codified references back into this one.
I feel like this is kind of a version of presentism, right? Or well, what's this a word for it where it's historical, essentially judging the past by the morality of the present.
No, yeah, presentism is, I think, a pretty good. I mean, I have to replace the British monarchy with Viggo. That rocks. Listen, fair enough. Okay, Viggo Mortensen, I don't even think is British. Isn't he from New Zealand?
We can, they're still a member of the Commonwealth, right?
Yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah, listen, he's still in the Empire, I guess.
It says American actor on here.
Oh wow. Okay, maybe he is American. I thought Viggo Mortensen.
He was born, or he's in New York. He was born in New York City.
Wow. You know what? He is American, okay, and that's awesome. And he should be the King of England. Okay, I'm now on board with this.
He has Danish citizenship, right? So that could be a real coup. Yes, there's an old movie that I haven't seen. It's King Ralph. It's the premise is that the entire royal family is taking a picture and they all die, and so they find this dude in America that is the last piece of the bloodline.
One of the famously hot Danes. Yeah, true, right? That actually is a weird overrepresentation of the Danish for how small that country is, right? In Mads Mikkelsen is Danish. All of the The Skarsgårds are Danish. The guy from Nikolai Kostai Waldau or whatever is Danish. The Jaime Lannister from Game of Thrones, right? Just a lot of Danish actors.
Yeah. I might be misremembering this, but no, it's not Danish. It's Dutch. That's very close to English. Um, I guess Danish kind of has this kind of like vague. The Danes have this kind of like vague, super villainish thing to them.
That's also true. Yeah, I guess they do have those accents, right?
Yeah, it's
that
like
make them.
The Scandinavian accents feel like vaguely sinister for whatever reason.
Oh, I'm actually lying. Stellan Skarsgård is actually Swedish. Okay.
Yeah, well, they're all they're all cousins up there, right? Sometimes literally. The Norwegians, the Finns are actually probably the most distinct, right? They're like technically like Suomi or whatever. It's like a second.
They're more Slavic than Scandinavian.
Yeah,
like I guess you would say in like technical terms.
Yeah, like I said, I think the peoples are called Suomi, and I think it's like a border culture between the Slavs and the Scandinavians.
Yeah, one of the famously hot Swedes. Yeah. Is Stellan Skarsgård famously hot? I mean, I definitely know that his like kids are, but I mean, like,
Swedes are famously attractive. Right? Like,
I guess that's true. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, are we done with Helldivers? Now we're talking about famously hot individuals.
Yeah. And Helldivers is why we know that Scandinavians are attractive. Yes.
Yeah. I'm definitely planning to play more Helldivers. We'll see. How I don't know how deep the Helldivers minds kind of go. So
yeah,
that's like my final thought on Helldivers.
Yeah. How's your week been?
How's my week been? I've been playing so much fucking Humankind, Mango. It's the dopamine mine. It's just I just go into the mines and I just mine the dopamine. I don't know why. I'm turning around at it. Last week I was like, "Oh, I really like Humankind. I think it's a good game." I actually kind of think it's a bad game again. But like in a way that like maybe I was sort of right when I said that all civ likes are kind of like weird and bad. It's just like you snowball so quickly in games like this that I don't know what I would do sort of like otherwise, right? It seems like by the time that I get to by the time that you get to sort of like maybe like Renaissance or whatever, like you as a player are just like so effective. I've bumped up the difficulty a bunch. And to be fair, there's some interesting stuff that Helldiver or not Helldivers that Humankind does with difficulty that I like better than just raw civ difficulty. Because the game isn't quite about racing. It is about getting the most points more so than it is about
racing to an endpoint.
Racing to an endpoint. The endpoint matters because the game ends, right? But you have to have the most points when the game ends. And one of the weird things that has happened to me is I'm pretty behind in points, even though I'm the first person. I'm the one racing to get to game over, right? But because I don't stick around in eras and farm points the way that the higher level AIs do, I actually get I'm behind going kind of like into the end game. And like obviously there's stuff that you can do to make up for it. And I have sort of, like kind of like done that in a way. But I don't know. Yeah, it just feels like no matter what, no matter how much I have like up to the difficulty and sort of like changed my sort of stuff, the game I reach that domineering place, and I get to the contemporary era, which is like the final of the eras, and I am just like gonna steamroll everybody at this point because like I'm just so good. Part of this I think is that I really love warfare in the game. Fighting those battles scratches a particularly great itch that is so fun, and I love it so much, and it's probably just the best way to like be good at the game, is to I basically just declare war as often as I possibly can, and I just constantly fight people. And when you can leverage that into even just money, there was a while where I was just farming people for money because you can just demand reparations and not take any territory or land or whatever. So you farm out war support, you take a bunch of money, and then you do that again when you farm out with like some more war support. You just leave your soldiers right on the front line and just keep plundering these guys for all of their cash. And I feel like maybe I'll try a pacifist run and see if it's still as sort of fun to play. Where all I'm doing is I'm just hanging out. I'm not trying to I'm not doing the thing where, but maybe this is really what it comes down to. When you declare war really early and you can take an enemy city really early, that's a huge bonus. I actually have kind of stopped settling my own cities because now my sort of play style is to just, because I'm just fighting people all the time, I just take the my opponent's capital as at the earliest opportunity. And now I have two capitals essentially that are just like a powerhouse that are these like powerhouses kind of production, right? It's not that it's easy to kind of like go from there, but I don't know. It
Yeah,
is.
I wonder if that's like a real balance problem, right? Like, it's effectively the amount of effort you're putting in to take the capital is a lot less than you would to like build up a second capital, right? Like,
Yeah.
and that kind of always has to be true, but like you kind of want it to be at a point where like it's not necessarily true, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that this might be the thing that is I think in every single game I have played recently, because this is really it's really easy to get into wars with people, right? You can just fight people like all the time, which is honestly kind of fun. This is sort of like Total War, this, right? You can just fight everybody all the time, and that's awesome, right? But it's pretty common for me that the first thing I do is I kind of build a relatively stable power base, and then I immediately farm out kind of like 2 stacks of units, and I just go to war, right? And when you go to war and you fight and you steal a bunch of gold and you steal a bunch of territory, maybe that just doing that in like the ancient era just catapults you so much farther ahead than kind of everybody else. The other thing is that I really like scaling stuff, and I sort of think that there were moments there are moments in the game where I can lose, right? But because I like scaling sort of civilizations, or sort of cultures is what they're called, right? The difficulty is sort of front loaded, and once you get past a certain point, your scaling just like reaches like cruise control, and you are far and away just like the number one kind of like person of the game, right? Which is different because there are certain cultures that are like momentarily good. They give you benefits that are useful right now, and you can carry those benefits forward to just like kick the shit out of people. Or there are bonuses that are like, you get a bunch of food. You get, one of the ones I like is the Taino, who are you get a certain amount of food per the number of territories in your sphere of influence, right? Sphere of influence is sort of like culture, right? If you have people in your culture, if you dominate a whole continent, as I've done, that is so much free food to every single city. It basically single-handedly solves my population problems, and I can just make gigantic mega cities off of this one cultural choice. But it's the kind of thing that you pick it in the medieval era and doesn't really pay off until like 2 eras kind of thing. And I think that, I don't know, maybe just starting the game by immediately going to war with your neighbors, best city, and ending the game with a bunch of scaling civilizations that all have bonuses that will see you through towards the very end of the game, is kind of just like a combination that built to like crack this thing wide open. And I have just like water fountains to crack my way into victory in human. I don't know. We'll see. But I am on my 4th playthrough in like the past like 2 weeks now.
Nice. On my end, I have been playing a bit of Cyberpunk and Street Fighter, as always. Street Fighter, I'm pretty stuck at Plat 4 for the moment. The finals are actually, or I don't know if the grand finals are happening yet, but like the Capcom Cup is happening as we're speaking, essentially, right? It's been over the past couple of days. I have not followed it directly. I will probably check out the grand finals whenever they are. I need to go figure that out, unless they are happening right now, in which case I will watch a replay. Cyberpunk, I'm getting to the point where it's kind of like I'm doing too many side quests. I need to just kind of like go do the story. Which is kind of what we're talking about with like this UB Towers problem. It's like, I gotta do everything. It's like, nah, not really. But there are some cool side stories. There always are, right? I enjoy the way the game works. Although I do feel like I've gotten to the point where like doing stuff like the kind of transit rewards don't feel like a thing that I care about as much, right? Like leveling up, like I've kind of like hit my build and it's like it's like very effective, and so I feel kind of fine with the way things are. But yeah, otherwise, I've been rotating between Helldivers and some WoW and Street Fighter and Cyberpunk. I'm trying to push through Cyberpunk because when I'm done with Cyberpunk, I need to play Death Stranding because I want to beat Death Stranding by the time Death Stranding 2 comes out, whenever that comes out. So that's a weird game, and I'm interested in it. But yeah.
I watched a GIF so many times on repeat of there was like it was a tweet, I think, actually. Maybe it was like a TikTok that was like I saw on Twitter or something like that. But it was just like we don't allow people to just be fucking idiots in games anymore, except for Kojima and Death Stranding. And the picture is of a guy who has loaded his bike with just literally every like package can, and he like hits a tiny rock and just goes tumbling forward, and everything goes flying. And it's just so funny to like look at that. I guess I don't know. I also sort of want to play Death Stranding. I'm like a big believer in like Kojima, like theoretically, but like fuck man, I've never played a Metal Gear Solid game. I say that's not true. I've like I don't know. I've like fucked around with some of them. I don't understand Metal Gear Solid lore. I've never played like Death Stranding or whatever. So I don't know. Maybe I will fuck around with Death Stranding just to see what happens.
Yeah. No, yeah. No, I mean, and like, the game is also like very silly, right? Like I've been watching this trailer. It's like there's a dude with like a guitar that like does fire, and then like there's a woman with like hands around her neck that like light a cigarette for her, which is like what is happening, right? Like, and genius Kojumbo, right? Like
yeah. How do you feel about Shadow of the Erdtree?
Oh, yeah, that's the thing.
That got announced this week.
Yeah. No, I need to figure out how I'm going to do that, because like there's part of me that's like, oh, maybe I should just like start a fresh playthrough with like a different, because like I played like a strength build the first time around. Maybe I should try and do like another playthrough and see and like have fun with it, and like like a more Dexy build. And part of me is like, I don't know if I want to go through all of that again, but maybe I will. I don't know. We'll see. I'm excited for it, but like not so much that like I'm like pissing my pants about it, right? Like I've kind of gotten to the point where like I am not hype about games until they're here. I've been good about that. Like the last game I like really, really highly anticipated was Street Fighter 6, which is good, right? Like it met my expectations, but like it's like, oh, Dragon's Dogma is coming out soon. I will check that out when it happens, right? I was going to check out Tekken 8. I still haven't, just because like I'm happy with Street Fighter 6 as my fighting game, right?
Do you think you're ever going to get into? Did you ever really get into like the position where you were like taking days off work to do games?
Yes.
Am I?
I have.
When was like the last time you did that?
I honestly, I don't quite remember, but I can say that I was planning on taking a day off for the release of the next CK3 expansion, but by sheer coincidence, I'm getting a day off the Friday after it releases, so I'm like, I'll just do that.
Yeah, like I'm probably gonna take some time off for like the new WoW expansion, probably.
Yeah, it might have been the last WoW expansion, right? Like that's those tend to be the ones. Just because like there's no blockbuster that I am so hyped for that I feel like I really need to get in. Especially because like a lot of the games that I think are going to be really neat are like online games, and those taking a day off for launch date is probably a mistake, right? Like it probably won't work.
Yeah, like if we had done that for Helldivers, right, we would have just been stuck in like some like server queue for 8,000 years.
It didn't even have a queue. The first time we tried to play, it was like booted up. It's like servers are full. and like it would try again, it didn't put you in a queue, just like, you know,
It just said servers were full. Get fucked, idiot. Like,
yeah. If you happen to hit it at the right, like, you know, it would put you on a timer, but the timer wasn't keeping you in order. It's just like checking at the moment that that it timed out. If like there was room, it was like, no more room. Still, so yeah, that's a big part of it for me. It doesn't stop me from like pre-ordering certain games, right? Like I pre-ordered the CK3 expansion.
Sure.
But like, and I kind of learned this, I will say, is that like pretty consistently, the games I'm having the most fun with are not the ones I anticipate. It's the ones that kind of like, you know, show up and like, you know, are critically acclaimed, then I go pick them up, right? Like that was Baldur's Gate, that was Helldivers, right? Like I got into it because other people were getting into it. I think part of that is like a lot of my value from games now is kind of the social aspect. And kind of like the better single player experiences are maybe better off like held off until they're like in a final state anyway, right?
Yeah, that's definitely very interesting. It's funny because like I kind of feel like I have three different modes of gameplay at the moment. I have I guess I would call them the social games, right? The game as conduit for social interactions with people, right? WoW is like this. This is a part of my, you know, like the web of my social life, and so I play WoW to connect with people. Then I have single player games that I play as like relaxation, which is like humankind is kind of this, right? You know, it is, I guess I would say challenging enough that, or maybe challenging is the wrong word, interesting enough that it like holds my attention, but I'm also just like fucking around, you know, like I'm watching the Venture Brothers on kind of like my other screen or something kind of along those lines. And then there are true single player experiences that I want to experience as, you know, I don't know, like a thing, right? You know, so I have played a couple of games like that recently. I don't know that I want to. I guess I don't know that I want to talk about them. It's like you know, some of the games that I work on fall in this category, right? Cryptmaster is like the example of this. I've been playing Cryptmaster internally, and I'm just part of this is me focusing on what the game is and what it's doing and the way it holds my attention. And I think those are kind of like the three modes that I play games in sort of these days. And I don't know, it's not it's interesting to think that certain games fall into certain other sort of I don't know, categories.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel that, and I think I fall into the same type of thing. And I think for me, a big part of the differentiation is like the single player games I'm playing in single player games either have to be interesting enough that I'm compelled by the story, or like challenging enough that I don't get bored with them, right? Like Elden Ring is definitely that latter. I mean, it doesn't have interesting story beats, but it's like I never got to the point where I felt like I was trivially going through things. I am kind of at that point with Cyberpunk, right? Where like a lot of the encounters feel trivial, and I feel like I'm cleaning up markers to clean up markers, and I need to stop doing that and do the story, and like get to Phantom Liberty and do that. Even if I miss some of the side content that I enjoyed in my previous playthrough. Whereas on the other hand, there are things like Chance of Sinar or South Skirmishaw, which are games talked about during the Derpies, which are like games that I want to like experience the story of, right? Like I have Outer Wilds that I never finished, so I want to go back and do that. That are like less about the gameplay, even or not less about the gameplay. There are neat things that the gameplay is doing, right? Like Chance of Sinar did some very cool stuff with the gameplay, but like the thing that drives me is like the uniqueness there, not kind of like the raw challenge of it, right? It's not like Street Fighter where I'm playing a competitive game and trying to build up, right? Like I'm playing a single play, like, you know, I'm playing the game to like to experience the unique mechanics, but not in a way that's kind of like a mechanical challenge. At least maybe it's like a mental challenge thing, right? Like it's like a puzzle.
Yeah.
Like I really enjoyed Return of the Obra Dinn. Still want to like a standout even years later, right? Like I can never play that game again because it's based on kind of like solving mysteries, right? And like maybe never, but I can never play that game for the first time again. Is a better way to put that, right? Like, you know, I can never experience the wonder there. Especially because the things that like I could go back and probably still get some fun out of it because I don't remember everything, but I'm gonna remember the things that caught me up the most, and so like that's the things like, oh well, I guess that's the thing there. But like, and that's why like something like Elden Ring is a thing I'm interested in going back to, because it's a mechanical challenge and there's a different way to play that game that I haven't done yet, and I'm theoretically interested in that.
Yeah.
Whereas like Cyberpunk, as soon as I finish this playthrough, I don't think I'm ever going back. Not because I don't think it's a good game, but just because, like, you know, I don't feel like the depth of the challenge there is enough to like continue. Like I'm bored of the gameplay essentially. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that, yeah, that's definitely, I don't know, man. Is that what's happening to me? And I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah, I like Humankind might be interesting to thing to do a multiplayer game on, because like that's like like this is my standard thing about these turn-based strategy games, right? Is like, I need human players to kind of like hone my steel against in order for me to find it super interesting.
Yeah, it's also interesting because one of the things about Humankind that I like is that you can't just go to war with people for no reason. You have to build war support, and wars are about managing war support, right? So one of the things that was interesting about this playthrough was I was in another Empire sphere of influence, and when you are in another Empire sphere of influence and you declare war on them, you take negative war support every turn. So you're fighting this uphill battle, trying to get more and more of it, so that you can because when their war support hits 0, you can force them to surrender. When your war support hits 0, they can force you to surrender, right? And that's like not something that you can do in Civ, right? In Civ,
Yeah.
you can just go, you can just fight people, you can just do whatever, right? And maybe I don't know, there might be like war weariness kind of like rules that I don't remember. I haven't played Civ 6 in so long. But yeah, so my thinking for Humankind is that managing the war support aspect of things, like really sort of like, I don't know, it really sort of matters. But one of the other things that you can do is make demands of people, and that can like build or your war support. And so I got to this point where I kept and there's honestly a really unintentional interaction where when you get peace with someone, you can instantly make demands that their armies stop trespassing, right? So what happens is, and this is kind of an exploit, I sort of just let their armies sit in my territory, and I force peace on them, and then I immediately make a ton of demands for trespassing. I say, hey, give me 5,000 gold for each of these armies that is like trespassing, right? And then they don't acquiesce to those demands, and now I'm building war support again, and now I can just repeat the cycle again and again. Obviously, I think that with a human player, you could ride that out a little bit more. A human player might be able to do some like interesting kind of like complex things with kind of like war support and all that other sort of stuff. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe it is like a multiplayer sort of like two humans fighting and doing stuff would be a more interesting way to approach things.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Like I'm thinking about like that sounds like CK3 in a lot of ways, right? Like,
Oh yeah.
yeah, like the war score isn't exactly the same thing, but like the way they solve it is that like you're on a 10-year peace treaty once you end the war, and and like your soldiers don't like you don't have that kind of like soldiers in a strange land type of problem immediately. So yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
also in CK3, the way like armies work is a little different, right? Like in a Civ-like game, destroying enemy armies is incredibly valuable because it represents setting someone back in terms of the opportunity cost of the production, right? Like if it took you 20 turns to put together a 6-person army and I stack wipe that army, I have forcibly wasted 20 turns of my opponent, right? On top of all of the population that goes into it. That's kind of true in CK3, but not as much,
Yeah.
right? Because like, a lot of those things are decoupled from
Yeah.
one another. So it's not like, you need to be dedicating essentially like raw production value towards your armies and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, we're at the hour and a half. I think that's every. Did you want to talk about anything else, or should we punch out?
No, I'm good. Let's punch the fuck out, buddy.
All right. Let's. If you'd like to talk to us about anything we talked about the podcast, you can email us at derpsgames@gmail.com or podcast@derpsgames.com. You can follow us at twitch.tv/derpsgames or youtube.com/games, where these go out live. Links are down in the description. That's basically everything I had. Buddy, do you have anything you're looking to promote?
I have nothing that I am looking to promote at this moment.
All right. Well, I'm going to say then, until next time, loyal listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners. Wait, you said dear listeners. I said
Yeah.
loyal listeners.
Yeah, I said it backwards. I screwed it up.
Or was I supposed to say dear listeners?
I don't
don't
know. No,
fucking know. Listen,
I kind of.
you know what? You're wrong. I'm right. I said my thing.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair. Dear listeners, goodbye.
Okay.